Now we're going to get the beams and the ceiling into place. Our beam is 10 inches wide by 18 inches high. So just along this wall, the first point I want to match, we're actually going to get back to this line here that we made a little while ago, this curved piece, because our beam is going to follow this curve exactly. So that's why we kept this. That's why we kept this piece. Let's take the tape measure and draw a line, or drag a guide, I should say, straight up along the blue axis. I'm going to hold shift down to force it along that axis, and I'm going to pop it to that point there, that end point there. That's our 23'9" for the bottom of that beam. Now let's take another tape guide and go up 18 inches. From this vertical line, I'll drag a guide 10 inches out. So this is the dimension of the profile of our beam. Go ahead and select that and make it a group. I'm going to draw a line. Well, first thing I'll do is I'll find the center point with a guide. And I'm going to make the exact same kinds of measurements I did on the first column we did. So we're going to go 1 inch, 1 inch, and then 1.5 out from the center. Take our rectangle, select this rectangle now. Instead of finding that other center point and copying it over, let's just copy it straight across and touch that opposite line. Just kind of trying to show you that there's multiple ways to do the same thing. Some easier, some a few more steps. So I've just now selected these two edges, these two lines, and deleted them, giving me this kind of T shape. This is the profile. Now, because I want this profile to follow this line, this path, using the Follow Me tool, what I have to do is I have to select this and explode it. So it's now no longer grouped. Now these pieces are all free to be clicked on individually. I'll select the path. That's the path I want this to follow. And notice the path is also not grouped. It's just a arch it's an arced line that's just right out in space. I'll activate my Follow Me tool by clicking once on it. And now I can click once on the face. And what that's going to do is that's going to extrude that profile all the way along that path, giving me that arch. Now I'll go ahead and I'll triple click on this, and I'll make it a group. I'm also going to open it up by double clicking, select the whole thing because it has given me the underside color, which is that purple. I'm going to select the whole thing, right click, and reverse faces, which is going to turn the faces to the white outer color, just for the interest of keeping this model clean. Let's go ahead and move this back, holding shift down until I touch this point here. And you can see that we're overlapping that top mullion piece that we had below. So let's select this from any point and move it up until it hits the top point like that. Okay. We'll fix this area in a moment. Now, right click and make this a component, because again, just like the columns and just like a lot of the mullions, we want this to be a repeated component that whenever we edit one, we edit all of them. I'm keeping this one in place for now. I'm going to get nice and close so I can see what I'm doing, and I'm going to activate my move tool. Excuse me. I'm going to click to that midpoint, click once, and I'm going to make a copy. And I'm dragging along the red, holding shift down. Now I'm just going to move my mouse until I touch the midpoint of the inside of this column. Click again. When I look at the photos, I can see that I have beams centered on each one of these columns, and in between, equidistant, I've got another beam. But because these are slightly different in terms of the spacing, I have to do this one by one. So I can either go from the midpoint or the edge, some sort of reference point that's going to be obvious. Let's go ahead and reference the upper corner of this. With this still selected, with this beam still selected, I'm going to touch the top point of the end point of this column, and I'm going to make another copy. Zooming out, zooming back in until I touch that exact same point on the next column over. Click. Now I will divide by 2, or backslash 2, enter. And that's going to give me a beam that is centered perfectly in between. Let's repeat that. Starting by selecting this piece, this beam, with my move tool, click on that endpoint, copy, click on that endpoint, divided by 2, enter. We got one more of those. So again, move. This is selected. I start with this endpoint. I make a copy. And I divide by 2. Enter. Now here, the spacing is really different. We're way shallow. But I can see in my photos that this is my last beam. So what I want to do is I want to do that same thing where I copy from this point to this point, but instead of dividing by 2, because it's not centered, if I look at the photos, this next beam over is a little further over to this side. So what I'll do is I'll maintain this same spacing by selecting this one, and I'll copy from this point here, hit my copy button, and then touch this point here on the far outside here. So basically what I've done is I've referenced the spacing in between these two beams. I've maintained that same cushion of spacing in between these two by selecting this one and moving it from this point. See? So that when I move it over here, it makes it in the same thing when I copy it. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. Whoops. Escape, and back to my select tool. So now I've got all of my beams in place. Okay, now I can do an edit, delete guides. My final step is to make the ceiling, but let's make sure that my beam is far enough over. It looks like because we move this up, we've got a little bit of a gap here, so I'm just going to open this up and clean this up by push-pulling this down till it meets that face, and then closing the component. And that's going to happen to all of them. Now what I want to do is I want to make this same arch above the top of this beam and extrude that across the whole thing. And it's going to be a lot simpler than you might think. Let me go ahead and isolate this one arch so that I'm not looking at everything else and getting confused. So I'm going to lock it, I'm going to select everything and hide everything, and then unlock it. Okay, let's go with our line tool and go straight up. Let's go dramatically straight up into space along the blue. Now I'm holding along the green, and I'm holding shift until I touch this far point here. Get a little closer so it's really obvious. And then I'll come straight down along that blue. Now I'm just going to copy this arch. So if I take my arc tool, the 2-point arc, and click from this point, zooming out to that point, and then dragging that bulge up until I touch the midpoint of that component, what I've done is I've made a shape. Go ahead and double click on it. I've made a shape that just follows the line of that top of that arc. So I'm going to make that into a group. Now I can unhide everything. Open this up by double clicking. Push pull all the way till I get to the edge of this final beam. Click. Now here's what I don't need. I don't need any of the top of this stuff. So I can select the top of this and delete it. Just selecting the lines I don't need. So here's my arched ceiling piece in place. Okay, the last thing I might do is I might put the ceiling and the beams on their own layer, or at the very least group them. So let's go ahead and hide this for a moment. Individually select all of these beams by clicking on them, holding Shift down, and then G to group them. Now, when I want to quickly see what I've got going on, I can select the roof, and I can select the beams below and hide them. Let me go ahead and unhide that for a second. Pull up your layer window and add a new layer. And the new layer is going to be called Roof. Enter. Pull up your entity info, window entity info, and select the top of the roof, move it to the roof layer, and go ahead and turn roof off so you can see that that actually made its way onto the roof layer. Select your group that contains all the beams in it and move it to the roof layer. Great. At this point, we don't need this path anymore because this path has given us all the information we needed from it. So we can go ahead and delete that. Let's turn that roof back on. Okay, so here we are. We've gotten pretty far. We've gotten to a point where we can comfortably say a lot of this information is in place. The final thing I might want to do is just close this gap here. So I'm going to use some guides, and I'll make a guide off at the top of this piece. And I'm just going to take a line tool and start from this point, getting nice and close. Make sure I get nice and close here to that point outside of the edge of that corner. Straight up along my guides. Using these guides to basically just snap to the points I want to snap to. Double click on that, make it a group. Double click on it to open it up. And push pull it all the way across till I get to the opposite beam. So I've closed that gap at the very top. You can also see that I've got a little bit of a gap here. So in fact, I'll actually push pull this all the way to the edge of this, close that, and then close this gap. So I've got this line I can look at, I've got this line I can project off of, and I've got this line here. We'll have a little tiny crack of a gap there. No one's ever going to see it, so I'm not worried about it. So I'm starting down at the bottom of this point with my line tool, and I'm just moving up and along. Now I can go ahead and select that line and delete it. And then delete the guides. Okay, so one final thing I'll do is I'll just reverse this space. Double click on it, reverse space. Okay, all the bones of this model are in place. So all of the heavy lifting is basically done. Now all we have left to do is to input some final detailed information.